Right, so the European Union has now found itself confronting a challenge it's for too long been evading. The Netherlands, off the back of formally declaring the state of Israel to be a national security threat to them now, has now formally informed Israel's ambassador in Amsterdam that it'll now push for the suspension of the trade-related section of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. Adding further weight to this declaration, Sweden has now declared publicly that it would be joining the Dutch in this call. So this joint move now marks a massive escalation in the EU's internal debate about how to respond to Israel's ongoing war in Gaza and the conditions imposed upon its population. For decades, the EU had signed agreements with Israel, coupled them with human rights language, and yet shied away from using that language as a legal basis for enforcement. The Netherlands and Sweden's intervention is now challenging that long-standing pattern of rhetorical concern that never gets backed up with any concrete action. The facts remain that Gaza's civilian population had faced catastrophic conditions. Reports from the World Food Programme, UNRWA, Médecins Sans Frontières, and other independent observers indicated acute malnutrition, widespread food insecurity, and blockades that choked the flow of life-saving supplies. So against this backdrop, the decision by two EU member states to seek suspension of trade preferences is not a gesture of political protest. It's demanding something that should have been done already finally being enacted. Right, so the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which entered into force in June of 2000, is a cornerstone of the bilateral relationship between the EU and Israel. It is one of the most comprehensive association agreements the EU maintains with any non-member country, encompassing not only trade but also political dialogue, economic cooperation and cultural exchange. At its core is Article 2, the so-called Human Rights Clause, which states that relations between the parties should be based on respect for human rights and democratic principles, and that these principles constitute an essential element of the agreement. Article 79 provides the enforcement mechanism, allowing either party in the event of a serious breach to take appropriate measures, which may include suspension of certain provisions. In legal terms, this clause is not a symbolic preamble, but a condition that underpins the entire agreement. Without adherence to it, the preferential arrangements that follow simply are not justified. Yet in the 25 years since the agreement's signature, the EU has never suspended the trade chapter under Article 2, despite repeated instances in which Israel's conduct in the occupied Palestinian territories has been condemned by international bodies as violations of international law. Instead, the EU has pursued far more limited measures, such as its 2015 guidelines requiring the labelling of products originating from Israeli settlements in the West Bank. That step, whilst significant in signalling non-recognition of settlement legality, left the underlying trade preferences still intact. This history has fueled accusations from civil society and from governments in the global south that the EU's human rights clauses are applied selectively, depending on the political sensitivities involved. Well, the Netherlands and Sweden's decision to move from rhetoric to enforcement has been shaped by a convergence of humanitarian, legal and political pressures of their own. In the Dutch case, Foreign Minister Casper Veldkamp told the National Parliament that Israel was not fulfilling its most basic obligations under both international law and the association agreement itself. He emphasised that the humanitarian situation in Gaza was terrible and that the Israeli blockade was fundamentally incompatible with the essential elements clause. For Sweden, Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson and Foreign Minister Maria Malmer Stenergaard delivered unusually forthright public statements, describing civilian starvation as a war crime and urging the EU to act quickly to freeze the economic preferences in order to pressure Israel to allow unhindered humanitarian access. Both governments are responding not only to the facts on the ground, but also to domestic political currents. In the Netherlands, sustained public protest, cross-party concern over the legality of Israel's actions, and a political culture that treats treaty compliance as a matter of national identity — they are home to The Hague, of all places after all push the government towards a harder line. In Sweden, the Gaza crisis fractured the usual cross-party restraint on Middle East policy, with humanitarian imperatives cutting across the traditional ideological divides. The immediate procedural context for this push is the EU's ongoing review of Israel's compliance with Article 2 of the Association Agreement. That review was initiated back in June of this year after pressure from the Netherlands again and 16 other member states at that point, and they're tasked with determining whether Israel's actions in Gaza amount to a serious breach of the human rights clause. It concludes that they do, and quite frankly I can't understand what they're looking at if they don't. The European Commission has the authority to recommend those appropriate measures to the Council of the EU. The nature of those measures, what they will look like, the legal basis chosen, matter greatly for how the decision can be taken. If the measure is framed as a suspension of the trade chapter, the tariff preferences granted to Israeli goods, it falls under the EU's common commercial policy. Decisions in that area are taken by qualified majority vote, meaning that 55% of member states, representing at least 65% of the EU's population, must agree. This is a markedly different threshold from that required for foreign policy sanctions under the common foreign and security policy, which requires unanimity. The trade route thus allows a determined coalition of states to act, even if a handful of powerful states happen to object. This legal pathway is part of why the Netherlands and Sweden's move is so significant, because it signals that they are aiming for a decision that can, in theory, bypass the unanimity vetoes that have long shielded Israel from EU-level sanctions. For the suspension to pass under qualified majority rules, the Netherlands and Sweden would need to build a coalition that goes beyond the usual group of human rights advocates in EU trade policy. Certain allies are likely to join with this: Ireland, Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, Finland, Slovenia, Portugal. They all have records of supporting stronger human rights enforcement and have in recent months criticised Israel's conduct in Gaza. Several of these states were part of that 9-member group that in June called for the talks on ending trade with Israeli settlements. The key swing states in this are France, Poland, and Denmark. France, as one of the EU's largest economies and most influential foreign policy actors, carries substantial weight. If Paris aligns with the pro-suspension bloc, it significantly boosts the population share towards that 65% threshold. Poland and Denmark, while less influential individually, could be decisive in reaching the required state count. Opposition is expected from, of course, Germany, which remains committed to strong bilateral ties with Israel, and also from the likes of Hungary, Austria, and the Czech Republic, which have all often acted as Israel's defenders within EU decision-making. Italy's position could go either way. While not always aligned with Israel, the Meloni government is generally sceptical of trade-based sanctions. So should the Council agree to suspend the trade chapter, though, the immediate economic effect would be to remove the preferential tariff rates that Israeli goods currently enjoy in the EU market. In 2024, EU imports from Israel totaled €15.9 billion, making the EU Israel's largest trading partner, bar none. These imports consist mainly of industrial products such as machinery, transport equipment, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, along with a substantial volume of agricultural goods. Under the association agreement, most of these products enter the EU either duty-free or at reduced tariffs. Without those preferences, they would revert to the EU's most favoured nation tariff schedule. The EU's average MFN tariff is approximately 5.1% on a simple average basis and about 3% on a trade-weighted basis. For Israel's current export profile, the effective tariff increase would likely fall somewhere between 2 and 4%, therefore, with agricultural products likely facing slightly higher rates. In monetary terms, this translates into direct additional tariff costs of roughly 320 to 640 million euros annually, potentially rising to 8 to 900 million euros if all high tariff agricultural products get included in that. The distribution of this cost between Israeli exporters and EU importers would depend on market conditions and contractual arrangements that are already in place. But beyond these direct costs, Israeli producers could face reduced market share as EU buyers shift to suppliers with preferential access, compressed profit margins as exporters absorb some tariff costs, and heightened compliance and reputational risks that might lead multinational companies to reassess supply chains involving Israel at all. So the political and reputational implications for Israel of even the current stage, 2 EU governments openly calling for suspension, are still substantial. For years, Israel has countered calls for economic pressure by portraying them as the work of fringe activists or ideologically driven NGOs. But when the advocates are instead established EU member states, and more than one of them here, citing binding treaty obligations, that portrayal loses all plausibility. The invocation of Article 2 as a legal basis carries its own weight. It is not simply an expression of moral outrage, but a formal assertion that Israel is in breach of a foundational element of its agreement with the EU. This places Israel in the same category procedurally as states the EU has penalised for human rights abuses, such as Belarus or Myanmar. The stigma attached to that classification could then be leveraged by other states and international organisations to justify their own restrictive measures. So by framing the Gaza blockade as incompatible with the norms of civilised trade, the Netherlands and Sweden are also helping to shift the narrative away from the idea that such matters are purely political disputes. Once established in EU discourse, this framing can influence debates in multilateral bodies and in other bilateral trade relationships as well. For the European Union, the stakes go beyond the bilateral relationship with Israel. The credibility of the EU's human rights clauses, embedded in all of its association and trade agreements, is directly at issue now. For decades, Brussels has presented itself as a value-based trading power, insisting that access to its market comes with obligations to uphold fundamental rights. If, faced with extensive documentation of humanitarian catastrophe and treaty breach, the EU then fails to act, it will send a message that these clauses are just ornamental, to be ignored when politically inconvenient, and that would be disastrous reputationally for the bloc. Conversely, enforcing the clause would strengthen the EU's claims to be a rules-bound actor, willing to apply its standards even to politically sensitive partners. It would also set a precedent that could be invoked in other contexts, bolstering the cause of those who argue for linking trade preferences to human rights performance in a meaningful way. If the pro-suspension coalition achieves a qualified majority and the Council votes to suspend the trade chapter, it will mark the first time the EU has applied such a measure to Israel. The economic consequences for Israel, whilst not catastrophic at a functional level, would still be felt sharply in specific sectors, particularly agriculture and certain other manufacturing niches. Politically, Israel will almost certainly respond with strong condemnation, like they always do. We know what they're going to do, don't we? We know what they're going to say. There will be accusations of bad faith. There will be possible reductions in cooperations in areas like research and security. I wouldn't bet money against them saying the EU are now anti-Semitic as well. Yet the precedent will still have been set. The EU's human rights clause is enforceable. If, on the other hand, the push stalls, whether because the Commission delivers an equivocal review or because the Council cannot assemble the necessary votes, the consequences for the EU's credibility will nonetheless be severe. After months of process and mounting evidence, inaction will be read as abdication of responsibility. It'll confirm the suspicion that the EU is willing to enforce its values only against partners with little political clout. Civil society within Europe, along with sympathetic national governments, may respond by taking their own measures, and certainly we've seen some of that already, such as Slovenia with its full arms embargo of Israel. But more widely, we could see banning of settlement products, again, something Slovenia has just now announced itself. But you could also see the restricting of procurement from Israeli firms or advancing recognition of Palestinian statehood by more states. Whatever the immediate outcome, the intervention by the Netherlands and Sweden has already shifted the EU's internal discourse. By grounding their calls in the legal framework of the association agreement, they've demonstrated that enforcement is not merely theoretical. This could embolden other member states to use similar arguments in different contexts, from North Africa to the Western Balkans. For Israel, the episode underscores that its once a secure position within Europe is no longer guaranteed. Even if suspension is avoided this time, the fact it was seriously contemplated at the Council level signals a new phase in the relationship, one in which legal obligations and human rights performance are more likely to be linked to market access. The decision by the Netherlands and Sweden to call for suspension of Israel's trade preferences over the Gaza crisis represents a turning point for the European Union's values-based trade policy. It poses a direct challenge to the EU's self-image and to its willingness to enforce the obligations it has embedded in its agreements. Acting would demonstrate that the EU is prepared to uphold its standards even when it is politically difficult. Failing to act would confirm that economic and strategic considerations override human rights commitments. In either case, the reputational damage to Israel has already been done, therefore, and would be all the more so if mainstream media outlets were actually reporting on this story. So do support your favourite independent outlets if you can to get the news you need to know. Two credible European governments have declared in legal terms that Israel's actions in Gaza violate the foundational terms of its relationship with the EU. That declaration should resonate far beyond the confines of Brussels diplomacy, influencing perceptions in markets around the globe, in international forums, and in public opinion across Europe and beyond, but only if people actually get told about it. For more on the Netherlands having declared itself that Israel is now a national security threat to them, do check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. They're not pulling any punches on that whatsoever. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.